Well, a boy who wears a dress to school in Cape Town has sparked debate. Is it time for pupils to be allowed to wear the school uniform of their choice? Activists have come out in support of this, saying school dress codes should allow trans or gender-neutral uniforms and creative combinations. So let's discuss this matter further with the director of the Equal Education Law Centre, Tshegofatso Phala. Tshegofatso, thank you so much for your time this morning. Let's talk a little bit about the story that has now started a bigger conversation around how even schools have got policies that support, for example, transgender learners, and whether or not schools are as conscious enough to understand the diverseness of the times that we live in. As you are looking at this story, what are your thoughts on it?
Morning, Faith. I think one of my first thoughts, for example, was the fact that this learner was called a boy. So one's not quite sure if the learner we're speaking about is a transgender boy or, in fact, a cisgender boy. So, that's something I think we need to be quite mindful of and name people, in the way that they identify. But the most important thing that comes out for me is that codes of conduct in school need to start complying with the Constitution. While school governing bodies can create their own codes of conduct and put in what they want to put in, schools need to realize that the time is up now where codes of conduct do not comply with our Constitution. Our Constitution is a transformative one, and we need to see codes of conduct aligning with the ethos and the spirit of transformation and equality and diversity of our Constitution.
Well, Tshegofatso, is it time now for schools to start looking at plans of being able to implement gender-neutral school uniforms to speak to exactly what you're saying around aligning with the Constitution as well as the rights of South African citizens?
It's definitely time. I think it's time that those code of conducts realize the diversity of our country, protect children's gender identity and their gender expression. And so, yes, I think it's long overdue. I think it's time, and I think that all schools should be looking into their policies and figuring out how their policies allow for their schools to be safe spaces, to be inclusive spaces, whether for transgender learners, whether for learners who are still just questioning and wondering who they are, and for learners who simply just are not comfortable in pants or in a skirt or in whatever it is that the school has given. So learners should really be able to look at the school uniform and pick what makes them comfortable and make our schools safe and comfortable spaces.
And I can hear, just to play devil's advocate for a little bit, traditionalists will say, listen, the school has got its rules, they've got a code of conduct, they've got a dress code, it's been adhered to for 30, 40, 50 years since the history of the school. Now we want to change it, and many would actually backfire and say, listen, change it to what end? We start by changing the school uniform. Before you know it, now we are adjusting school rules so that we can suit the times. What happens to our traditional ethos as well as the traditional foundations of certain learning institutions? How then do we respond to certain forms of thinking?
Look, I think it's a balance. I think the first and foremost thing is that our Constitution recognizes that there's a need for us to transform society. It recognizes that society is ever changing, and that's what it seeks to protect. It does also recognize tradition, but tradition has to be reasonable. Tradition needs to protect rights. Tradition needs to protect people. And people just need to realize, in a transformative constitutionalist country, if protecting people's rights means we're changing every day or every month, then so be it, until we get to a point where everybody in our country feels equal, feels like they can be themselves with dignity, and they can identify in ways that they choose to identify.
Well, Tshegofatso, but are schools in South Africa ready for such a mindset shift?
Faith, I really don't think it's a question about are we ready. I think it's about how are we going to make those shifts. Because I think that rights of transgender, lesbian learners cannot continue to be deferred at the arms of people who are ready or not ready. I think even, for example, on race, we would never ask, are we ready? I think the question is, we start today, and how are we going to do it? The conversations are about how are we going to support people's knowledge? How are we going to educate our teachers? We at the Equal Education Law Centre monthly have matters where principals are coming in and saying, we don't know what to do. Please support us. In the Western Cape, for example, we've had them saying that they're going to publish guidelines on sexual orientation and gender identity for months, for years now. Last year, we got told they were going to be published in December. Now we're being told they'll be published by the end of the year. Nationally, we don't have a policy that kind of guides school communities on how to be diverse, on how to be inclusive. Those have also been in the making for years now. Yes, it's welcoming that those policies are being drafted, but it's concerning that they're taking so long. It's concerning that there's nothing that guides the school communities. And so it's not about, are we ready? It's about, well, we start today, but how do we start?
I mean, speaking about how we start today and how do we start, I mean, the Western Cape Education Department, for example, was drafting guidelines on gender identity as well as sexual orientation for public schools. And this was obviously with the aim of creating an environment and an educational environment that is more inclusive as well as free of stigma and discrimination. We're expecting that very same guideline to be made available to schools later this year. And one wonders, if it's only later in 2022, how many children in schools will be going through the very same debacle in the debates around I identify as either cisgender or I identify as transgender, and what exactly does that mean for me as well as my daily lived experience in school?
Exactly. The reports, and a lot of research has shown that for LGBTI learners, our schools are not safe places. Our schools are where transphobia happens every day, discrimination happens every day. And it's concerning. It's also concerning that we continue to deal with these things as guidelines, so soft things. We aren't able to say it's a policy, something strong, something we stand by. And so I think as civil society, as activists, we're kind of tired of lip service being paid to the protection of this vulnerable grouping. They are children. Their identity and their sexual orientation makes them even more so vulnerable. And so really there's a responsibility for our state to protect them. And as I said, there's a responsibility for us as a society to embrace the transformative nature of our constitution, not to pick and choose when it's okay and who's allowed rights and who isn't allowed rights. For who is it immediate and for who are we willing to wait? And I think that's just unacceptable. Schooling spaces need to be safe for every learner, no matter who they are, how they identify, and that's an important project we need to begin with, not when, but today.
Tshegofatso Phala, the Director of the Equal Education Law Centre, thank you very much for your time this morning.